with an opening prayer. If you have your Bibles with you, I thought we'd pray at least part of Psalm 137. And I think this is one of those Psalms that gets reassigned the numbers depending on your version. So I'm using my Ignatius Study Bible, Revised Standard Version, and so it's Psalm 137 in mine. But I think it's also Psalm 136 in some other enumerations of the Psalms. But it's the lament over the destruction of Jerusalem, and it's a psalm that I've had on my mind a lot since St. Patrick's Day, as Stephanie mentioned, the last time that we were able to have a public celebration of the Mass. So I thought it would be appropriate for us today. Since we all have different translations, it might be awkward for us to try to read it together. So I'll just read it aloud and you can read in whatever translation you have. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our lyres. For there our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So this month I wanted to talk about liturgy, and so I didn't know we were going to be without the Mass at the time, so it kind of adds a particular flavor to our topic today. But I want to proceed with that idea in mind that we just read about in the Psalm. This is really my hope. Right after this happened, matter of fact, I'd had a meeting scheduled that day. I was getting together with somebody right after Mass to plan for a class that was no longer happening once I got the announcement. And so him and I were talking, and we were just talking about, like, what is this going to do to the church? Like, what is going to happen to the people who, what do we say? 80% of Catholics nationwide don't attend Mass weekly. What is this suspension of the public celebration of the Mass going to do to the participation of the faithful? If somebody's right on the edge anyway, and then they say, wait a minute, you're telling me one week you're telling me it's optional to come, I can come if I want. The next week you're saying don't come at all, still send your money, but don't come. How are people going to interpret this? And so we kind of went down, into the dumps for a while in our conversation. But then I kind of came out of that saying, I want to look at Psalm 137. I said, this is my hope that this is going to be kind of an experience of captivity for the church, is that we're kind of in exile right now, and it's a time for us to remember what we lost and to remember what is going to be restored again. And as Stephanie said, it hasn't been lost, right? It hasn't been lost. Jesus is still there. The Mass is still being celebrated on our behalf. Jesus is still present in our tabernacles. But so, not to sound too melodramatic, but it is still somewhat of an experience of exile, that we've been taken away from our customary place, from our rituals. But I kind of want to be like these people lamenting the loss of the temple and the loss of Zion, and so that when Mass is restored, it's my hope that people are going to flock back to Mass. That the faithful that go every week, we're going to be there no matter what. We're just waiting for the green light. Everybody in this class is going to be right back in the pew, sitting in the same place they were. But it's my hope that those people who are kind of intermittent Mass goers will go every week now. And it's my hope that those of us, that are weekly attendees or daily attendees, that every single person would attend Mass with a special fervor and reverence and attentiveness once we're able to do so again. So that's my hope. We know that God works in all situations. We know that God is the author of all of history, and that He's able to work good out of even the most futile seeming situations. And so, you know, those of you who have been to some of our other classes know I like to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien a lot. And so he's got this phrase, the eucatastrophe, where just when everything seems like it couldn't get any worse, something from that very situation emerges to make something better than anyone could have ever expected happen. And so that's my hope. So that's my little pep talk before we start today, is that everything's going to be okay. We're going to get back to Mass, sooner, hopefully than later. And it's going to be a resurgence in the church. That's my hope. Okay. So we changed the timeline a little bit after last session because we're behind. We're actually not as far behind as I thought we'd probably be by this point. So some of you, I don't know if you got the email, and some of you have already turned in your essays on the Eucharist, which is great. But I went ahead and pushed that back because we're going to talk about the theology of the Eucharist next month. And we're going to talk about the liturgy today, which is what you read and wrote about for last session. So on March 7th, you were prepared to talk about the liturgy in class, and we were still finishing exegesis. So you wrote on two questions. One was discuss the significance of the first words of the Nicene Creed, Credo in Unum Deum, which Barron describes as being much more than an intellectual conviction. How does hearing those words as an existential statement, as Barron describes them, add to its significance? So you answered that question. And so one of the ideas that some of you talked about was that liturgically, when we proclaim the creed together or separately in our living rooms now, one of the things that's happening is that we're laying out the tenets of the faith, right? So we're laying out what we believe in a pretty particular way, a pretty detailed theological way. But that's not the impetus of that exercise. That's not the main point. The point is that we're establishing, in Barron's mind, our relationship to God and all of reality by that statement. So when we say that we believe in one God, yes, we're like refuting a heresy. If we look, historically, we're establishing orthodoxy, but we're also saying that we believe that everything that exists is, by definition, in existence only in relationship to that one God. And so this is a theme that Barron has laid out several times in several different ways in his textbook, which is kind of the foundation of his whole approach. This kind of Thomistic approach is that there's only one infinite being. There's only one example of the act to be, which is God. And then everything else is dependent upon that and is relative to that. So that statement, when we say that, I believe in one God, we're really saying that I'm not a creature independent of God, that I'm a creature in relationship to God. And in fact, everyone else in the room is, and everything else is. Everything is a relationship to God. So that's one of the things you might have thought about when you were reflecting on that question. And then the second question was, discuss the significance of the sending forth at the end of Mass, focusing on the aspect of mission. And so this, the sending forth words, ita missa est, that sometimes, we translate that as the Mass is ended. You could translate that, I suppose, as simply the Mass is, that we have been sent. And so, and I like the pious custom of, that you remain after Mass and you say some prayers. I like that. I like to do that. But sometimes I almost think it's funny. when I do that, because I'm like, I'm supposed to be sent and I'm just like kneeling down, but I'm probably overthinking it. I like some of the stories like from the Crusades and from like the Albigensian wars, where we have, I think one of the stories is Saint Dominic saying the mass, and then I can't remember the leader. Can't remember the general. Stephanie probably remembers it, but anyways, but they hear the mass, and then they're like on horseback, and they hear those words, and then they wheel around and they charge out into battle. So like that's ascending forth, right? So that's kind of the idea that I try to keep in mind when we're sent forth after mass. We've received something, and it's not just for us. It's not just to like ruminate in our hearts. It is supposed to ruminate in our hearts, but then it's supposed to go forth and like become Christ incarnate in the world. So those are some of the things you might have thought about for that reflection, the mission aspect of the sending forth at Mass. We really are sent. We're sent like a missile, like an apostle. Okay, questions or comments on either of those? It's going to be ironic if I stop more for questions and I'm more conversational on a computer than I am in class. But I'm making a conscious effort to do that. So. It brings it to the forefront. When I'm in front of you all, I just take for granted that you can interrupt me at any time. But when I'm here, like on my own in my basement, I have to be very conscious of the fact that I'm talking with people. At least I've got the little thumbnails there. I saw a funny meme on Facebook where it said the Zoom Last Supper, and it was like the painting of the Last Supper, but it was just Jesus, and then the top was thumbnails of all the apostles. I thought it was pretty funny. So please interrupt and jump in. So I want to talk a little bit about the liturgy, and then I want to do something else. So let's talk about the liturgy. So I hope most of you got the handouts that I emailed. If not, I can email them again. I found that I've got like multiple lists of, anyways, some of you missed, some of you, I failed to get the emails to some of you. But I did have a couple of handouts with some excerpts from two really important, I think, documents regarding the liturgy. One is Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is the document on the liturgy at Second Vatican Council. So I want to go through some parts of that. And then another one that we won't probably talk as specifically about, but that I just wanted to give you for your own reading, was some excerpts from The Spirit of the Liturgy by Father Romano Guardini. And so hopefully we can talk about some of those aspects too. But I wanted to start out just by talking about the nature of liturgy, and then end up going full circle into talking about what the liturgy has to do with soteriology, or the study of how salvation works, which I think is an interesting discussion. And then that'll lead us into our kind of excursus conversation that's going to take the place of our guest lecture today, since that didn't work out. Father Orr was going to come and speak with us, and then on St. Patrick's Day, when we heard everything was canceled, I talked with him and said, hey, I think we're shut down, so I don't think we're going to be able to do it. And then so he redid his schedule, and then I called him this week saying, hey, I'm going to do it on Zoom, can you join us? And it didn't work out for him. So that was my mistake. I should have just told him to keep the date and that we would figure it out. But anyways, so liturgy, let's start there. I wanted to talk first in its most general sense about the liturgy as being something that's almost universal, that I think sometimes we think the liturgy is very, very particular to our creed and our customs, is that we have this like strange idea that we should do liturgy. So I wanted to draw the lens back a little bit and just look at liturgy as really a way to satisfy this natural indebtedness that humanity experiences, right? So basically all cultures up until, say, the 18th century or so, um, have recognized that they were created and that they are totally dependent upon a creator for their continued existence. Um, they believe both of those things. And then, as a corollary to that, they recognize that there was some debt that they owed for this unmerited existence, right? So that's something that we take for granted as Christians, but we see that in the secular world, those things are not necessarily held anymore in anything close to a universal sense. But this is a natural human experience, is that we recognize that we ought to give thanks to something. Okay? That's an interesting question, for somebody who claims to be an atheist, is when you feel thankful, who do you thank? And they might say it's individual persons or something, but you can extend that and say, well, when you feel this sense of gratitude that goes beyond something that was immediately recognizable as being given to you by another person, who do you think? When you walk outside and it's a beautiful day, or you see see a beautiful sunset, or you see a beautiful mountain landscape, and you feel something well up inside of you, where is that directed, right? So um, human cultures until the modern era have done this naturally. Okay, so they want to give thanks, and they want to desire, in maybe a more selfish way, they desire protection from something outside of themselves, and so they might be very confused about how they seek that protection, but they seek after it nonetheless, and so they create mythologies and systems of gods that govern the various natural elements or the different activities of life, like war and agriculture and fertility, etc., um, because they're trying to seek protection for themselves, right? And so they create these elaborate systems of making offerings to gods in the hopes of reward. And so we get this kind of contractual understanding of prayer, is that I do something for this particular god. I go and I stop at this shrine on my way to battle, and if I offer the right amount of incense, then he's going to help me out in battle. And then I go out about the rest of my day, and I probably don't think about the gods again until the next time I need help or whatever. Or maybe if I'm really pious, I'll remember to give some thanks afterwards. But it's more of a contractual experience. Now, don't get me wrong, there was real piety in some of these ancient cultures. So I'm thinking of, like, the pious Aeneas in the Aeneid and things of that nature. But the piety was different in the pre-Christian era. So we'll just leave it at that. We could talk a long time about that. But moving from a pagan understanding of the pantheon to the Judeo-Christian understanding of the one God, okay, like that we profess in the creed, this is a radical shift in prayer, because now we are no longer offering prayer as a way to change the disposition of a immutable God. We are now offering prayer because it's just, okay? Because that's what we ought to do based on our creatureliness. And secondarily, we do it because it has the effect of changing us, right? So we offer prayers to God, and they don't change God's disposition, but they do change our disposition. And that's something that St. Augustine and others have elaborated upon, is that the prayer changes us rather than God. We're also praying to a God that we know as being a God that's not bound by time. Okay. So that opens up a whole new dimension for the things that we can pray for and the ways that God can answer those prayers. Because he can hear prayers and answer prayers in a way that's not bound by our strict chronology. So we can pray for something, and he can wrap up his answer to that prayer as he writes salvation history. What do I mean by that? So somebody is sick and you pray for that person. Okay. And the skeptic might be watching you pray for that person, and they might say, well, that's interesting. George is praying for Joan. That's nice of George to do that. But how is George's prayers for Joan going to affect the eternal, unchanging God who already knows everything that's going to happen throughout history, right? And this is something that Augustine goes into, is this like, it's really what later becomes double predestination that Calvin will kind of take off in its own direction. But Augustine talks about predestination, that God knows everything that's going to happen already. And so the skeptic might say, well, how are your prayers going to change something that God's already authored and already sees happening? And how does that work with free will and all of that? Well, one way to answer that is by saying that because of our belief in God's omniscience and his sovereignty over all of salvation history, we can say that God from all time saw those prayers that you offered on April 4th, 2020. He saw those from all eternity. And so he wrapped those prayers into the way he wrote all the rest of history. So do you see how that works? It's a beautiful reflection. It is that Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, who some of you have heard of, a great Dominican teacher, he reflects on, he uses the example of what parents do for children. So you might have had the experience of you go and you buy a present for your child, or you get some treat at the store, whatever, you get some ice cream or something. And, you come in the house and you might require something of your child in order to get that treat, right? It's like, oh, have you been good today? Well, daddy got something special, but let me check with mom, see if you've been good, or, whatever it is. The point being that you've already procured the gift, right? It's already there. They're probably going to get it no matter what, right? I mean, you're kind of creating this scenario where they have to do something to get it, but the point is you're planning to give it to them. And you're just waiting for the opportunity to do so. And so their fulfillment of that requirement is just the green light for you to do what you're already planning on doing. So Father Garrigou-Lagrange uses that analogy to show that that's what God's doing for us, right? Is that he's got all these good things, that he's like the loving father who's like picked up some stuff at the store and he's just waiting for the opportunity to give it to us. But the point being that for God, if we don't participate with that process, they'll just like forever remain, in a state of potential, right? That we won't receive them, even though he's planning from all eternity to give them to us. So it's that those individual prayers aren't creating a new desire in God to help us. The desire is already there. If I can use the term of desire in application to God, but by nature, God wants to give us those good things, but we have to do something to enable us to receive those things. So here are some words from Father Garrigou-Lagrange on the efficacy of prayer. He says, God wills the final effect first of all. Then he disposes the means and causes that are to produce it. Having decided to give, he decides that we ought to pray in order to receive, just as a good father of a family who has decided to give his children some pleasure wants them to ask for it. He goes on. These are some quotes from his book, Knowing the Love of God, Lessons from a Spiritual Master, which I think was previously published under a different title, I think it was called The Last Words of Father Lagrange or something. But anyways, it's from that book. Later he says, when we pray and are heard, it seems to us that the will of God has yielded toward us. It is our will, however, that is raised toward him in such a manner that we are disposed to will in time what God wills for us from eternity. Okay, so that's one aspect of what's happening in prayer in general. Now, let's talk about liturgy in specific. Liturgy is different than private prayer, than devotions, personal prayer, right? So we pray all the time. We're supposed to, right? Pray always is several of the saints have used phrases like that. So we give spontaneous prayers, that hopefully we're offering throughout the day. We all have our devotions, things like the rosary, etc. When we move to liturgy, we're talking no longer about a purely personal and private prayer, but we're talking about a communal prayer. And so liturgy is a Greek word which refers to the public work that is required in justice from citizens. Okay, so liturgy has even a secular sense in ancient Greek culture. So liturgy is what you're supposed to do. If you're a citizen, this is what you're supposed to do to help the body politic, the polis. Okay, and so I think it's important to have that understanding of liturgy in mind, because as we'll see, one of the things that happens is that we begin to mix liturgy and private devotion. Okay, and there's a real distinction there. Is that sometimes we liturgize our devotions and we devotionalize our liturgies, and it's not a strict black and white separation, but there is a distinction, and so the liturgy is a public work, and it's a work to satisfy justice. It's what is due from us to God, okay, because of all He's given to us. It's natural, and so I like to start Catholic social teaching classes off with that. That's how I always try to start if I'm teaching on Catholic social teaching, because people take that and then they go on down all these shoots, and sometimes they forget to start with the top. Is that if we're going to have a just society, it's got to be a society that offers worship and obedience to God, because if you're not doing that, then nothing else you can do can be just. And so anyways, I don't want to go off on that tangent, but it's due to every culture to be obedient to God, to offer sacrifice to Him. We owe it to Him. I know that language isn't very romantic, but we owe it to God. Does He need it? No, He's totally sufficient, but we need it to satisfy justice. Okay, so then in the Old Testament, so we have the secular sense of liturgy. In the Old Testament, we find the language of liturgy used frequently in the book of Exodus, as it comes to the functionality of the priests at the temple. So the priests are performing liturgy. When we hear of the story of the conception of John the Baptist, we hear that Zechariah has just completed his liturgy, his time of service at the temple. Okay, so liturgy is all about service, particularly service on behalf of the community. Liturgical worship is done on behalf of the community, so on behalf of all of the community. This is another important part of liturgy, is that which is good for us to reflect on right now, particularly because we can't go and attend the Mass, but the Mass is carried out on behalf of everyone in the community, not just the people that are present in the room. So your pastor at your church, he's responsible for all of the souls that live in his parish boundaries. In fact, he's responsible for all of the souls, Catholic or non-Catholic. He's been entrusted with every soul in his parish boundaries. And so the prayers that he offers benefit you, whether you're at Mass or not. So again, we've got a Sunday obligation. So I'm not saying you don't have to go to Mass on Sundays in ordinary circumstances when we don't have a pandemic. But even for daily Masses, even if you're out of town, you're at a different parish or whatnot, you're benefiting from his celebration of the Mass, because it's done on behalf of all of the community for the good of all of the community. We use that in the preface to the Eucharistic prayer. We say, it is right and just. That's one of our responses, is that it is right and just that we engage in this holy sacrifice of the Mass. And so it satisfies the vertical dimension of justice between us and God as individuals, but it does so in a communal fashion as well. So sometimes, people will use the metaphor of the shape of the cross, right? So we've got the vertical dimension, which is longer, it's more pronounced, but then there's this horizontal dimension too. So it's just kind of a nice visual, is that that rightness and justness satisfy both of those dimensions. And so we, in the New Testament, we have passages about settling disputes among one another before we offer our gift of sacrifice. And so we can talk about the communal dimensions of sin, the fact that our sins affect everyone in the community, but it's this, that it's together we are offering the sacrifice. It's all about togetherness. I want to look, but with that in mind, that's why I included some of the readings, and I understand you probably haven't had time to get to them yet, but some of the readings on the Spirit of the Liturgy by Father Romano Guardini, because in Guardini's writing, he does a tremendous job of emphasizing the communal dimension of liturgy and describing that the liturgy is not about satisfying your own personal inclinations, okay? And he also establishes that the communal aspect, likewise, is not about melding your desires and tastes with that of the community, right? Because sometimes we get it like, we think there's this tension of like, well, Mass is about me, between Mass is about us, and we miss the boat on both counts, because really Mass is about God, right? And so in Guardini's writings, he talks about the fact that the Mass, for example, can't be primarily about emotion. That's one of his really poignant insights, is that the emotional component of liturgy is there, but he describes it as like it's smoldering. Like he describes it as like fire in the heart of a mountain, of a volcano. So it's there, it's producing heat, but only every once in a while does it bubble forth, in some manifestation. And so that's how he describes the role of the emotion in liturgy. And so he says liturgy should be heartfelt, they should be emotional, but they can't be driven by emotion. They have to be driven by the intellect, he says, which I think is a really important insight, because he says that if you're shooting for an emotional experience at liturgy, and we've all been there, right? So you all of you have been to the celebration of the Mass, and I'm not here to certainly to poke fun at any liturgical musicians or any priests that have orchestrated Masses in this way, but you've all been to Masses where you can tell that they're really hamming it up, trying to elicit an emotional response, so that the hymns are sappy, the gestures are overdone. You've all been there. I don't want to go into examples of how that can be done. But so Guardini says is that when people try to make an emotional experience of the liturgy, what ends up happening is that you get different personality types. And he doesn't use the language of personality types, but this is what he's talking about. He says you get different personality types that are getting moved in directions that is not good to move in. And so he basically says that that you get people who are either pretending to be swept up by the same emotion that everyone else is. And so you've probably seen, videos on YouTube or whatever of like the hysteria that goes on at some like Pentecostal prayer services and things, where people just get swept up in this frenzy of emotion. And so that's exactly what happens. So people get swept up, but they don't really know what they're trying to experience. It's not based on the intellect, it's based on emotion. So he says you either get that people get swept up in something that isn't really authentically moving them, they're just kind of being drawn along, or you get people that totally reject it, right? Which is, like, let's be honest, like that would be my experience, kind of the more introverted person, like they're around, people start coming with the, trying to hold hands and doing all that stuff, it's just like zoop, just kind of shut it all out and be like, all right, I guess I'm excluded from what you're doing here. So he says that an overly emotional approach to liturgy often has one of those two effects. And so So when you get time, these are just some excerpts. The entire book isn't very long, The Spirit of the Liturgy, but I just took some excerpts from each of the chapters here. The first chapter is on the prayer of the liturgy. The second chapter is on the fellowship of the liturgy. Then he talks about the style and the symbolism of the liturgy. And then another important insight that I want to bring to your attention is chapter 5 is called the playfulness of the liturgy, which is really a beautiful chapter. So Guardini is from a similar philosophical school to people like Josef Pieper, who really talk about contemplation as the natural human condition, right? Is that we're really made not for activity, but for contemplation and leisure. And so, which Pieper was actually a student of Romano Guardini to some degree. Pieper wrote his dissertation on Guardini, and they had some interacting in the 20s. But anyways, so in chapter 5, he talks about the playfulness of the liturgy, and he's not talking about being silly at Mass, right? He's not talking about like doing cutesy, things that are what we normally think of as play. He's talking about play in the sense of the natural state of man, is that at liturgy there should be this calm, and there should be the sense that we're doing what is natural to us, so we're not performing. So sometimes people with really good intention get so focused on the liturgy that it's like they're actors in a play. Okay, that it's like they have to do everything perfect, and everything has to be elegant and grand and refined, and it becomes unnatural. And so Guardini emphasizes the purposelessness of liturgy. And that's going to strike the Western mind as being really strange. But Guardini says that the liturgy is purposeless. There's no purpose to the liturgy. And now, as kind of a Western educated person, you might say, well, that's blasphemous. That's offensive to say that there's no purpose to the liturgy. But his point is that the liturgy is not a means to an end. Okay, the liturgy is not a means to an end. That the liturgy is a good in itself. And so we can't use those same categories of thought that we use for other processes that produce an end that we want, right? It's not just like some other work that we go and do because we're trying to get some good benefit from it. He says the liturgy is a good in itself. And so at the liturgy, we should be like a child at play. And so he has these lines where he compares to the liturgical man as a child at play, where a child playing in their own little world, he says there's no purpose there, but there's great meaning. There's great meaning to a child at play. And this is very, like those of you who like G.K. Chesterton, this is very Chestertonian, is that a child has great meaning in their experience as a child. They don't have any purpose. They don't have any goals or aims in mind, but there's great meaning there. And so a good touch point to compare would be to compare liturgy in this sense with something like the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius of Loyola. Okay, so this is a good comparison. So the spiritual exercises of Ignatius, those are not liturgical. Those are geared at an effect. So it's an exercise that you go through with a particular point. Okay, and they're good, they're excellent, but it's different. It's something different than liturgy. And so liturgy doesn't have a set purpose. It's that's the way we're supposed to operate in relationship to God. Something like the spiritual exercises is us saying, I need a change in myself. I need to strengthen my spiritual life. So I'm going through these exercises in order to do that. So you see, we have to have that tension of knowing the different aspects of these different religious exercises that we do, so that we can really focus on what those are supposed to bring for us and how we're supposed to enter into those. So Guardini uses the example of a gymnasium. And so he says that in a gymnasium, you go in there and there's different apparatus for all these different things, and they're all geared towards a purpose. He says liturgy is not like walking into a gymnasium. He says liturgy is more like walking into a forest, where there's this relationship with everything there, but there's not this distinction um, and this separation and this clear, cold, black and white purposefulness behind everything there. Everything just kind of blends together. So you walk in the trees and the rocks and the streams and everything just kind of blends together, and it all adds something to the experience. But it's not like you go to the gym and you put on your earbuds and you look at your watch and you say, all right, I got 10 minutes on each station, and you go bam, bam, you hit station to station or whatever. That's not what we're doing when we pray, at least in a liturgical way. Okay. Questions, comment, let's pause there. And then maybe you might want to get a cup of coffee or something too. Let's pause now for questions, reflections, whatever.
Is part of the difference that Ward Edie is talking about is that when we're engaged in like the spiritual exercises, to some extent, we're directing what we're doing. And in the liturgy, God is really, because in the Catholic Mass, we know Jesus is offering the sacrifice to the Father, and we're participating in that. So that's really the action. The action first starts with that, not with us having a goal in mind. Is that one way to think about it?
Right. No, that's right. That's perfect, Stephanie's. Yeah. So it's more of a passive experience, is that we're entering into a work that's being done on our behalf. So yeah, I like the way you put that, is that it's not us taking the initiative. And even, in like with the spiritual exercises, there's even the guidance of a particular director, right? So it's like we've taken this initiative, we're being guided by a director who's attentive to our personal disposition, but the liturgy is something that's being guided by God. So we're not doing the work, God's doing the work. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Which is really helpful to keep in mind. I think not that it should lead to at all any kind of laxity, but it's good to keep that perspective, because I think sometimes we get so focused on doing the liturgy perfectly that we think we're the ones doing it, if that makes sense. God's doing the work, and we have to participate with it in an appropriate way. But you're right, we're not taking the lead.
Thank you.
Okay. The other handout I gave you were some excerpts from Sacrosanctum Concilium. And so I just want to, again, that's something, if you haven't read that document ever, or if you haven't read it in, 10 years or so, that would be a great document just to read in its entirety. I pulled out some excerpts, not that these are the most significant parts of the document, but I thought that they were worth our discussion because they're of particular interest. And so, so the first paragraph, and so I'll just kind of go through this. If you've got that handout, and I'm sorry if maybe you have a printer at home, maybe you have a hard copy. Otherwise, if it's on your computer, you might have to minimize your screen or something to look at it. But the first excerpt I have there is from paragraph 2, and it says, "It is of the essence of the Church that she be both human and divine, visible and yet invisibly equipped, eager to act and yet intent on contemplation, present in this world and yet not at home in it. And she is all these things in such wise that in her the human is directed and subordinated to the divine, the visible likewise to the invisible, action to contemplation, and this present world to that city yet to come which we seek." And so I just thought this was a beautiful paragraph, kind of laying out the perspective on the liturgy, that it integrates the human and the divine, but the human is always subjugated to the divine. Okay, so it's oriented towards the divine. And we could talk about, Jesus tells us that the Sabbath is not for the Sabbath is for man, right? And so I think it's when he's getting reprimanded for eating the bread that was only for the priests. But so this idea that the Sabbath is for the benefit of man. And that's true. That's absolutely true. And within that belief, that if we really believe that the Sabbath is for man, then we can see that it's this raising up of man from the human to the divine. And so that relationship between activity and contemplation is really at the heart of the spiritual life. It's really at the heart of culture, I think, is how do we respond to that question? How do we respond to the relationship between action and contemplation? And how do we see that action is always leading towards contemplation? So it's not a strict separation. It's not that we've got action over here, you guys can be the actives, we got contemplation over here, you guys are contemplating, good job, keep it up, and you know, like never the two shall meet. It's not like that at all. It's that there's this blending of action and contemplation, and like so many things, it all comes together at the Mass, right? So like if you only had one tool available to teach people about life, um, the Mass would do it, right? So you can use the Mass to teach about all aspects of the Christian experience. And that's one of them. It's that action and contemplation come together at the Mass. Our activity, all the things that we offer spiritually, which we're doing like online right now because we can't go to Mass, but we're offering everything that we do in our active life to the sacrifice of the Mass, which ends in contemplation. Um, so the visible is subjugated to the invisible. Okay, so then that goes into even particulars of liturgy, is that what's really important is what's happening invisibly at the liturgy. What's most important is not what's happening visibly. And there's a tension there, right? Because obviously we don't want to be minimalists that just say, all right, well, we don't need anything for liturgy. Let's just, you know, come as you are, and, you know, doesn't matter, shorts and flip-flops, you're good, doesn't matter what's visible. Okay, strip the bare essentials, don't need anything on the altar, don't need any decorations or anything like that, because it's all invisible. Okay, I don't think we want to go that far. But there's a balance there. There's a tension, is that if we get too focused on the visible, then we can, even with the greatest intention, we can kind of like flatten the horizon of the Mass because we think it's all about what we're doing. But then on the flip side, if we kind of lower the visible, then that also can lower our experience of the invisible too. So like anything else, there's a balance and there's a tension there. But I think that proper orientation is important before we talk about liturgy, that orderedness that's described in paragraph 2 there. The next paragraph I have for you, paragraph 7, says every liturgical celebration, because it is an action of Christ the priest and of his body, which is the church, is a sacred action surpassing all others. No other action of the church can equal its efficacy by the same title and to the same degree. So we've talked about this already, but that ordering of private devotions to liturgical actions is that the liturgy carries a special weight. That's not to say that our private devotions are not important. That's not to say that they're not essential, because they are, but they're all ordered towards that liturgical experience and that liturgical sacrifice. Paragraph 10, the next paragraph on your handout, the liturgy is the summit toward which the activity of the church is directed. At the same time, it is the font from which all her power flows. Okay, so everything is directed towards the liturgy, and then the liturgy is what drives all the other work of the church. So looking at that combination of the action and the contemplation of the church. So our activity is ordered towards contemplation, and then that contemplation becomes the fuel, so to speak, for the activity of the church. And so, you know, you can take, for the prime example is the life of Jesus, right? That we see all of this activity in his earthly life, but then what does he do at night? Quite often he retires in prayer to spend, sometimes it seems as if he spends the entire night in prayer. So it's this kind of breathing in and out. He goes in and out of active life. So his communication with his Heavenly Father then becomes manifest in his activity with his disciples and with all the people that he encounters. And so it's a great model for us, is that we retire into contemplation, we go back out. So it's this in and out for most of us in the lay vocation, right? If we're not a professed contemplative, we go in and out of contemplation. Our contemplation fuels our work, or it ought to. And in that sense, even our work can take on a dimension of contemplation. And so some authors, Hans Urs von Balthasar is one that I really like. And his book on prayer talks about how contemplate, and some people don't like his approach, but I think it's very useful. He talks about how the active life can be a form of contemplation, and I think it's beautiful. Let's see, next paragraph 14, which is the fourth on your list. Mother Church earnestly desires that all the faithful should be led to that fully conscious and active participation in liturgical celebrations, which is demanded by the very nature of the liturgy. Okay, this paragraph 14, this is one that's gotten talked about a lot since this was promulgated at the Second Vatican Council. This phrase, fully conscious and active participation. What does that mean? We are all supposed to fully, consciously participate in an active way at Mass. Well, I don't know what that means. One way that people have interpreted that to mean is that we should all do more stuff at Mass. I don't think that that's necessarily what that means, because some people have taken that to like, okay, we're all supposed to actively participate at Mass, so here's a tambourine, hit these two mallets together at the right time. Now you're participating, and so it's we need more lectors, more Eucharistic ministers, more readers, more all this stuff that goes into us all having a job. I'm not saying that good spiritual fruit cannot come from being involved in that way. That's not my point. But I think when we start thinking that active participation means that I have a visible job, I think that's distracting, frankly. So the active participation is primarily, and this is just my read on it, you can disagree with me if you want. My read on it is this is primarily an intellectual and spiritual directive here, is that we're all supposed to be attentive to what's happening at the Mass. We're supposed to be offering our spiritual sacrifice to that we're offering ourselves at the Mass. It's not about our activity. It's not about how loud we sing, anything like that. This is a primarily internal directive here in paragraph 14. It's not to say that people who are outwardly involved cannot also have that interior disposition, right? So I'm not saying that just because people are like excited to be involved in stuff, that they're doing that instead of following paragraph 14. That's not what I'm saying either. You can do both, but I think what's being directed here is that it's primarily an interior participation in the Mass that doesn't have to be manifested by a visible activity. Paragraph 21, the liturgy is made up of immutable elements divinely instituted and of elements subject to change.
Chatico, estoy en una teleconferencia de teología. ¿Te puedes llamar cuando terminemos?
The liturgy is made up of immutable elements divinely instituted and elements subject to change. These not only may, but ought to be changed with the passage of time, if they've suffered from the intrusion of anything out of harmony with the inner nature of the liturgy or have become unsuited to it. All right, so most of what we talked about so far is pretty straightforward. Hold on, I'm having some audio issues here. There we go. So most of what we've talked about before is pretty straightforward. This is getting a little bit more complex in the sense that it's talking about how customs develop, right? And so we've talked a lot about the development of doctrine and how our doctrines deepen and they go deeper and wider over time as we delve into the mysteries of the faith. Well, our liturgical customs also change. They can change and they should change following the directives of this document. Um, so going through this paragraph piece by piece, the elements are immutable and divinely instituted. So the main features, if you will, of the Mass, those aren't going to change. What's happening at the Mass and the main components of the Mass, the core of it cannot change because it's divinely instituted, right? So we read about, St. Paul tells us about what happened at the Last Supper, that was revealed to him. So we hear about the eyewitness testimony in the Gospels of the Last Supper. So we have some things that are divinely instituted, they don't change. But there are elements that are subject to change, is what it says in paragraph 21. Particularly if they've suffered from the intrusion of anything out of harmony with the inner nature of liturgy, right? And so I won't go into specific things that this can be applied to, but I just wanted to lay that out there, is that the church has this guiding hand when it sees that a practice has come into place. It has not only the right but the obligation to kind of steer that back in the other direction if they see that it's taking away from the inner harmony of the Mass. And so I mentioned that because I think from all sides, from you get people who don't want anything to change, okay? Whether it's they don't want anything to change from the 1200s or the 1500s or the 1970s. In any time period, you have people that say, this is the way that I did it at a certain time, so I don't want that to ever change. And that can be an unhealthy disposition. And so the church is saying that the church is always evaluating things that are subject to change. And if it's getting out of harmony with the inner nature of the Mass, then it needs to change. And so we'll just leave it at that. We could have debates of the particulars of that at another time.
Dusty?
Stephanie, yes.
I think there is one good example is when Pope St. Pius X said, shouldn't have the long classical masses like Mozart masses or Beethoven masses. Instead, go back to the Gregorian chant that is more simple and doesn't distract. Because I have been to a couple of masses with a bard or hum mass, and it could go on. The Gloria can go on forever. The Creed can last a long time, so that you almost become distracted, and the whole flow of the Mass is broken up. But that was something, again, that the church was changing. Not me, but the church. Pope Pius thought that was a change that needed to be made, so that the celebration of the Mass was not a performance of a classical piece of music.
That's a great example, Stephanie. Yeah, and I think even even in more common experiences, that can be a risk. When we have this tension of when we want to elevate the liturgy, and so we want to add beauty to it, but it's a really fine line between what's a reverent beauty and then what's a distracted beauty. And so I'm glad you brought that up. So yeah, that would be an example of beauty that can become a distraction. And we've probably all experienced that, where we're, I can think of a few masses in particular where at the same time I was swept away thinking, wow, this is beautiful. But then I was also like, this is too much like a performance, and so there's a tension there. So that's a great point. The next couple other things for our attention. Paragraph 22 says, no other person, even if he be a priest, may add, remove, or change anything in the liturgy on his own authority. So this goes back to Stephanie's point about the voice of the church through the authority of the Pope in that case, where it's not an individual pastor saying, hey, this is the way I do it. We're changing everything. That there's a continuity in our activity. And again, there's leeway within the Mass. For example, there's things that we have to do, and then there are things that are based on taste. And so it gives us lots of opportunity to, have quarrels about. But that's the point, is no individual can change anything by their own authority. Paragraph 23, there must be no innovations unless the good of the church genuinely and certainly requires them. Paragraph 28 says, in liturgical celebrations, each person, minister or layman who has an office to perform should do all of, but only those parts which pertain to his office. Okay, and so I point this out just as a good, time to reflect on kind of the hierarchy of the church, and that there are different ways to participate. So going back to that paragraph 14, where it says that we're all to actively and consciously participate. Well, the mode of that participation varies greatly in the most obvious way based on our vocational state, right? So we have the priests that have one very clear role in the liturgy. We have the laity, which has another role, which is not quite as clear because we've got some kind of cross between, that the laity have been asked to do other roles that have been traditionally reserved for the priest, based on matters of expediency and necessity that sometimes gets difficult to make those decisions, and sometimes it gets confusing when those lines are blurred, if you will. So, but the church does say that our roles shouldn't infringe upon the roles of another person, and so there has been, in the decades after the Vatican Council, in various ways, there's been a push to involve the laity more in different things that had been traditionally reserved for the clergy. Um, and without saying too much about it, I think it's just good to reflect on that when we start overlapping in our roles, there can be some issues that come from that, and some confusion that comes from that. So anyways, we can talk more if you have particular questions about that. We can talk about those too. But moving to paragraph 30, at the proper times, all should observe a reverent silence. So I pointed this out just because another instance where, if we're trying to focus on a purely emotional experience, that might not lend itself well to periods of silence. When we're trying to maintain a reverent silence, okay, how do we do that, right? So it doesn't just say there should be silence. It said there should be a reverent silence. And so a reverent silence seems to suggest that there would be some flow, whereas the silence has particular significance, okay? We've all been at masses where there's been silence that's awkward, right? There's awkward silence. and sometimes it's just because there's like confusion of like who's supposed to do what or whatever. Some of the masses that only happen once a year, it happens. But sometimes I've been at masses, and I'm sure you have too, where with good intention, the celebrant or maybe another minister is trying to produce a silence with the intention of making it a reverent silence, but it just becomes a distracted silence. It just doesn't flow. It gets where you're like, all right, this is awkward. And so what's the right way to do it? You only know it when you've done it. But there's a reverent silence where the silences are placed at the right times for the right duration of time. Okay, once it exceeds that, it can become distracting. And again, we don't want to be splitting hairs here. But the point is, reverent silence. How do you do that? That's a good question. But when you experience it, you say this is the right time for silence. This is a reverent silence. But we need to include it. If it's just start to finish noise, then we're missing something of the rhythm of the liturgy. Paragraph 33, although the sacred liturgy is above all things the worship of the divine majesty, it likewise contains much instruction for the faithful. I pulled out this excerpt just to bring to our attention this relationship between catechesis and worship, okay? Because if we miss catechesis, then we're missing an opportunity, okay? But if we focus exclusively on catechesis, or almost exclusively on catechesis, then it can take away from the worship. So again, it's a tension. we should be learning at Mass. Okay, Mass is a privileged opportunity to instruct the faithful, but it ought not be the only way that the faithful are instructed. And if we assume that the liturgy is the only place that the faithful are going to be instructed, then we're probably going to be trying to do too much instruction to the faithful when we ought to be focusing on worship. Does that make sense? So it contains instruction, but it's not about instruction. So back to that reflection from Guardini. This is very consistent with what Guardini says, is that there's not a point of the Mass. And so I think sometimes we get into that habit of like, you got to go to Mass so you learn your faith. You got to go to Mass so you hear the homily. You got to go to Mass so you can learn the scriptures or whatever. And there's truth to that. But I think that can be a distraction of what the point of liturgy is. And so, again, that's why it's good that we do studies outside of Mass, right? So what all of you have dedicated yourself to doing is learning about the faith and doing reflection outside of Mass so that you can bring all of that insight to the celebration of the Mass, right? Okay, enough said on that one. Same paragraph says, moreover, the prayers addressed to God by the priest who presides over the assembly in the person of Christ are said in the name of the entire holy people and of all present. I included this this outline. I mean, frankly, at one point somebody asked me if I would address the question of people holding hands at Mass. Right. So at one point somebody said, "Will you speak on this?" And so this paragraph reminds me of that, is that this understanding that that the priest is offering all of our prayers to us. And so in that particular question, and somebody was asking me about, why do people stand in the congregation holding their hands like this? And so they were asking, and they were kind of just confused. They were like, well, I see some people and they're like putting their hands down, they're holding each other's hands. Some people are holding hands like this. And so I said, well, there's two different things happening there. I said, some people have gotten into the custom of that they hold one another's hand, which is not wrong or sinful or anything. It's kind of traditionally understood as that it's not necessary, so we probably shouldn't add it in there, and it can be distracting. And with the coronavirus, this is a great way to just knock all of that out. But there's nothing inherently problematic about that liturgically, maybe just a little uncomfortable. But the idea of like, you get all these people in the congregation, they're doing this, and they unknowingly probably, but they're mimicking the priest's posture. So the priest making this orans posture, which is the posture that he rightfully assumes as the one offering the prayers for the community. So that is a problem. And I'm not saying it's like they're committing a sin or something, because if they're confused and they don't know what they're doing, but that is problematic, because that's not really representing what we believe is happening. And so the idea is that all of the faithful are adding our prayers, and that all of those prayers are being offered by the priest on our behalf. And so that's why I just wanted to reflect on that paragraph, that the priest is addressing all of our prayers to God. And so another way to think about that is, so like, our responses are pretty minimal in Mass. The words that we say, we don't say a lot in comparison to the priest. But every word that the priest says, we're being attentive to it. We're actively participating in that prayer being offered. And so it's just as if we said the prayer. Now, would it be appropriate if we said all the prayers along with the priest? No, because that would be infringing on his position as the member of the body of Christ. But that's the point, is that so when all the beautiful prayers that the priest is saying, it's just like you're saying those prayers. He's saying them on your behalf. And so it's a beautiful relationship there. A couple of other things. There's a paragraph there about, and we won't go into the details, but there's a paragraph there about Latin in the Mass, for example. And so, again, I just thought it'd be good, if you haven't read what the church actually says, it would be good to read it, because I think a lot of times people just say, oh, Latin was thrown out at Vatican II. Well, Latin was not thrown out at Vatican II. And actually, if you read the applicable paragraphs, it seems that there wasn't really intended to be a wholesale change for the vernacular. Latin was supposed to still have a privileged place in the Mass, but the vernacular, it's recognized that it can be of great benefit, particularly at certain parts of the Mass. But it doesn't seem that this document envisioned that Latin would totally go away from the Mass, and that certain parts would probably always remain in Latin at the Mass. So it's just for your reading and your reflection, not trying to delve into controversy or be divisive or anything like that. But it's just good to reflect on the universal language of the church, and that beautiful tradition that we have. There's also some things in there about Gregorian chant that Stephanie mentioned earlier, and the use of the organ, and that these are privileged expressions of liturgical music. Not to say that we can't use other kinds of liturgical music, but these are given to us, they're offered to us by the church as being a privileged expression and a very appropriate way to enter into liturgical music. So there's a paragraph there, paragraph 52, which is the last paragraph on the first page, about the homily. And it says, the homily, therefore, is to be highly esteemed as part of the liturgy itself. In fact, at those masses which are celebrated with the assistance of the people on Sundays and feasts of obligation, it should not be omitted except for a serious reason. Again, with our being excluded from the physical buildings of the churches right now, and only being able to participate by viewing masses, it's another chance to reflect on this component of church teaching, is that the homily is an important part, and it should be included on Sundays and on feast days, but it's not mandatory on daily Mass, for example. And so it's a reminder that, so if you go to a Mass and after the gospel, the priest just walks back to his chair and sits down, and you're like, what are you doing? Like, it's your time right now, and you're disappointed. You know, I've heard people get like upset about that. You know, just relax. It doesn't have to be offered every time. It reminds us of the main purpose of the Mass. The main purpose of the Mass is not the homily. The homily ought to be provided on Sundays and feast days, and when possible on daily Mass. And most of, you know, around here, most of the priests do offer a homily on daily Mass. It's a wonderful bonus at Mass that we can receive that instruction. But if it's not there, our experience of the Mass shouldn't be lessened. Frankly, and this is not to any detriment of any pastor I've ever had, but sometimes if I've well prepared for Mass and I've reflected on the readings, and you've all had this experience too, where then the homily, like you feel like you've got this great, like you've read the collect and you've read the readings, and you're like, I feel like I'm really liturgically in tune with what's happening at this Mass. And then the homily is something different, and then you're like all befuddled. And so it's a good so if you don't have a homily offered, sometimes it's a great opportunity for you to just be able to continue in your own reflection, and like, where do you think the readings were going that day? What were your own reflections? And so just let those resonate in your heart. So you fill in your own homily, so to speak, but you don't say it out loud. All right. So, and you know, a couple other, and then I'll stop for questions here in a moment, or comments. I'm not going to read all of these, but the final paragraph I'll mention is paragraph 55, which says communion under both kinds may be granted when the bishops think fit. And so, again, just kind of, I know in the timeline of what's happened this year, that was like the first step, is I think that the bishop said that, you know, we shouldn't offer the precious blood, and that happened a few months ago, to protect against the accidental spread of a virus. and some people were upset by that. And so again, I just wanted to kind of restore to what does the church teach. We don't have to have communion under both kinds. We believe, and I know all of you know this, but just as a refresher, we believe that the full presence of God, body, blood, soul, and divinity, is present under both species of the Eucharist, under the body or the blood. So some people can't receive the body because of gluten or other things. It can be received only in the blood. But receiving only the body is a full experience of the sacrament. Receiving the precious blood is an added sign. It's a sign of that communion that's fully happened at with the body. So again, I know right now we can't receive either, but just as kind of a refresher of what does the church teach, you're not missing out on anything if you only receive the body. And that's back to the earlier paragraph about the participation of people in their various states and not infringing on others. One of the practical issues that arises by that good intention, that really good intention, that we want to offer the precious blood to everyone, well, one of the issues that comes from that is then, like, how do we do that practically? And so then you get this kind of amplification of extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion in order to provide that. And so it creates some other issues too. And so some bishops in their diocese, I can think of one in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I know there are others, but that they don't ordinarily have the precious blood, just for that reason, just kind of out of a reverent, prudent desire to kind of limit the how far we spread the faculties of the ministers of communion. So anyways, it's not wrong. It's not wrong to receive both kinds. It's not wrong to have extraordinary ministers, but it's just good to reflect on what the church has taught us on that. So I'm going to close. So let's stop with that now. We've gotten through most of Sacrosanctum Concilium excerpts. You can read The Spirit of the Liturgy by Father Romano Guardini on your own. I encourage you to do that. What I'd like to do now is to open up for questions, comments, reflections. I know we went really quickly through that. We'll take some questions on that, and then if you're willing to stick with me here, I guess we're at 10:30, so we've been going about an hour and a half. But I wanted to have another discussion, which would take the place of our guest lecture after these questions, and maybe a short break. So what questions or comments do you have?
Dusty, this is Stephanie. I do have one comment. I noticed in that last paragraph, sometimes we have to remind ourselves of this since we don't have the presence of this in our diocese, but paragraph 120, it begins with the words or the excerpts that you gave. In the Latin Church, I think we always have to remember the Eastern Rite. Many of the things that we're talking about that happened in the liturgy through the Second Vatican Council did not affect the Eastern Rite at all. They don't use Latin. They always have communion in both forms because communion is celebrated, received differently. Mm-hmm. They don't have any organ. Everything is a cappella. They don't have any musical instruments. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. There's a part of the church that has not changed at all in its celebration of the liturgy.
That's right.
And I think they've usually always used the vernacular. Wherever they were using the vernacular of that. I mean, maybe they had some Greek, probably more Greek or Aramaic, but that's just an interesting thing to think about. We're the Latin Roman Rite. They are the Eastern Catholic Rite, and it's different.
Right. That's a great point. Which there's 7 or 8, or there's a number of Eastern Rite Catholics. So Latin is just one of. Do you know how many there are, Stephanie?
I don't know. There are dozens because they can kind of have kind of not totally national as much as the Eastern Orthodox do, but there's quite a variety of liturgies that they have. I mean, they even have liturgies for just one day a year, or I think there's one Sunday a year that the Eastern Rite Catholics or Eastern Orthodox celebrate the liturgy of St. James or something like that. So there can be all these different variations. So, but that's the main thing, is nothing changed.
Yeah.
The Second Vatican Council came and went, the 70s came and went, and nothing really changed for them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
I had a wondering, this is Josh. You were back up, I forget where, talking about some of the difficulties that have arisen from having to hand over more roles to laity because something was said about priest shortage or whatever. And does the re-emergence of the permanent diaconate kind of address that to some extent?
It could, and that's a good question. If you didn't hear him, he was asking about the permanent diaconate as a way, because so when we say an extraordinary minister, so we're saying first, when like 15 years ago, when my pastor asked if I'd be an extraordinary minister, I thought he was just saying like I was super special, like I'm extraordinary. But you know, the term extraordinary doesn't mean that you're great. It means that you're out of the normal line of you're out of the normal sequence. And so, you know, we write that on students' papers, like this is extraordinary, meaning that like you're outside of the normal, you know, like where people normally fall. So an extraordinary minister means that we wouldn't normally have the faculties to do that. So to distribute to communion, bishops, priests, and deacons are the ordinary ministers. And so what Josh is saying is that the question he's raising is that could extending the diaconate, in our diocese we have only transitional deacons, could extending the permanent diaconate then help us kind of maybe add, and maybe I'm putting some words in Josh's mouth, but to his question of would it allow us to kind of reserve those roles for ordinary ministers rather than feeling that we need to use extraordinary ministers? And I think that's a great question.
Yeah,
I think that's a great question.
Pretty fair. And it especially came to my attention recently because, well, for one thing, I have an uncle in Minnesota who's a permanent deacon. And that's kind of how I got, you know, pushed into the church, is some of his examples. But I was looking up on the internet, just kind of trying to get an idea of how extensive the diaconate has progressed in the U.S. And I think literally our diocese is one of one or two. Like, we're basically the only ones left that don't have a permanent diaconate program. It just kind of flabbergasted me.
That's interesting. I think, and hopefully I'm not speaking out of school on this. I would guess that part of that is that we've been blessed by plenty, and I shouldn't say plenty, we could always use more, but we have a lot of vocations to the priesthood here. But that is interesting that it's being used that extensively in other dioceses. I know, just anecdotally speaking, and just talking with other, you know, priests and bishops, is that I know there's a lot that has to go into the formation, and I know that's been the concern with lots of places, and I'm not going to name any dioceses in particular because I don't have any in mind, but I just know in general there's a question of bringing in deacons that maybe aren't super well formed for the diaconate.
Well,
you see what I'm saying?
I'm sorry, I've thought about this a whole lot. We already have it in place. That master's degree, that Newman, that's exactly, like, that's the prerequisites. You need a master's in theology, and then there's like a formation period where you basically kind of put in time, you know, basically proving that this is something you really want to do. And it's kind of like an internship or something. And you're just under the pastor at your church. But our structure is basically in place. That's why it's interesting to me.
Yeah,
and
well,
I'm sure we have more priests than other places. But for example, at my parish, he's desperate. Like, he's struggling. He can barely keep up.
Yeah. Well, I know Bishop McKnight wrote his whole dissertation, and I think he published it as a book on the diaconate. I haven't read it. I'd be interested to read it because honestly, I don't know a lot about the work that's been done and on that. But I know Bishop McKnight is very interested in it.
Mm-hmm.
Are we still muted?
No. Hey, Dusty,
Hey, Chris.
sorry to intrude on your class, but Barb asked me to give my 2 cents, and it's maybe worth 1 cent. But the reason, according to my experience and just picking up things at the Chancery, is the reason we don't have a permanent diaconate is because we have not a surplus of priests, but we have enough priests. And I'm sorry, I didn't hear everything you said. But so the bishop didn't want to start something, and who knows how much trouble it would be to have a lot of permanent deacons. I don't know. I have no experience, and this diocese has no experience. But when you introduce something like that, you're going to introduce more and more challenges for the bishop, I think. And so there's a combination of having enough priests, probably take care of sacraments and take care of, of anything that a deacon could do. And then you just get the lay people to fill in rather than having a permanent diaconate. But I don't know that a bishop has ever said that officially. That's just a sense I picked up, and maybe you have that too.
Yeah, I do. That's I agree with both of those points, Chris. I think that's the main thing.
And this is Stephanie. There would also be an issue that you would have to remunerate. You have to support. If he, by definition, if he's a permanent deacon, meaning that he could be married.
No, that's actually
then he has
not
family
true.
to support too.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Like I said, my uncle's a permanent deacon, and the diaconate is not a remunerated position. It's a lay position. Now, there are some permanent deacons that become, achieve a position in the church, just like Dusty as a lay person has a position, in the church. They can, be pastors, or not pastors, but like assistant pastors. But it's not a paid position like a priest.
Yeah, there would be lots of details, and I'm sure there's different models for it too. But we'll see. It sounds like there's lots of people interested in the question for sure, and so we'll see what happens. But yeah, that would be an option. Other questions or comments? So my coffee's empty and my coffee pot's upstairs. So I was going to take like a couple minutes. So if you can take a short break or whatever, and I hope you can stick around. What I'd like to do, and I know you probably haven't had a chance to read it, and at the risk of stirring the pot, I've gave you some notes from a really interesting book that was recommended to me by several people, more than one, of being an interesting book to read. So I said, all right, I'll pick it up. I read it. And that was going to be sort of the topic that Father Orr was going to discuss with us today. And so I called him yesterday. We talked on the phone about it for a while. So I'm not going to try to put any words. I'm not going to like put him on the hook for anything, but I just basically told him I'm still going to talk to the class about it since I thought it was interesting. So I got some of his ideas. I read, not the entire book, but I read most of the book yesterday. And so I thought that would make a lively discussion for our sort of like our guest presentation. So hopefully, if you want to stick around for that, I hope you will. Let's meet back in like 5 minutes. My computer says 10:44 right now, so 10:45. So about 10:50, let's meet back and we can talk about David Bentley Hart's book on universal salvation. So it should be fun. All right, be right back. I sent a one-page, a little bit over one-page set of notes from a very interesting book called That All Shall Be Saved, Heaven, Hell, and Universal Salvation by David Bentley Hart. Now, I haven't read a lot from David Bentley Hart. Some of you might have read a whole lot from him. I've read some stuff from him and I've really liked everything I've read by him. He's a really good author, very knowledgeable on church history and on different aspects of theology. I know he's translated the New Testament, so he's an eminent scholar. But this book was recommended to me, and I almost scoffed at it at first, and just kind of filed it in the part of my brain where I file things that I don't really ever want to look at. I'm just like, you know what, I'm not going to have time to read this book, or why would I want to read this? But I said, you know what, I need to read this book, and I did. I admit I haven't finished it, but I read the first main section where he lays out his argument, and I read his conclusion. In his book, if you have a chance to pick it up, in the middle section, he's got 4 meditations on the nature of God, and I haven't gotten to those yet. But I did read his argument and his conclusions, and I was very interested by it. I found it very interesting. In the course of the talk today and our discussion, I'm not going to advocate any particular position, but this is a theology class, and I think it's important that we do more than just repeat the doctrines that we have. It's good that we explore and we reflect, and we consider how the revealed doctrine of our faith can be mined for things which may go beyond or extend or challenge the way things that often have been described. Okay, so we're not going to be challenging any church doctrine today, but we are going to be discussing things that might go beyond or might be slightly different than the way that the story has been told. And that's how David Bentley Hart kind of phrases it. He basically says that there's revelation, and then there's a story that we've told based on that revelation, and that what he's doing is that he's departing from the story that's been told. He's not departing from the revealed doctrine, in his opinion. Now, it should be noted that he's not a Roman Catholic. David Bentley Hart is an Eastern Orthodox theologian, so there's going to be some differences there right out of the gate. But anyways, I wanted to offer this to you, and I'm offering it to you all as students of theology. So I'm taking for granted that you already know your doctrine, and that you are now able to engage with some really difficult and deep things to think about. So I'm taking that for granted. I'm assuming that that's the case, because I don't want to scandalize anybody. I'm assuming that you have a strong foundation already, and that's why you're doing theology now, and not just catechetics. So with that all being said, as sort of a prelude, laying out David Bentley Hart's argument, he basically says that he does not believe in an everlasting hell of punishment, period. He believes that a person who believes in eternal damnation is violating the rules of reason. And he makes a couple of different approaches to that, which I think are worth our attention. He says that an infinite punishment, so eternal punishment in hell, doesn't seem like a fitting response to a finite failure. Okay, so in Hart's opinion, we have a finite lifespan, for example. So we've got, as the scripture says, 70 or 80 years. In the modern day, a lot of people live longer than that. But we have a very finite lifetime. So even a depraved life, according to Hart, would not merit an eternal punishment that is not bound by time. In addition to that, Hart makes note of our limited freedom. Okay, so, and here he builds on what St. Augustine says about our restless hearts. And so most of you are probably familiar with Augustine's famous line about our hearts being restless until they rest in God. And so this understanding of our pursuit of our desires is really a pursuit of the good. So we're all only capable of desiring the good. The problem is that we pursue the good in disordered ways. And so no matter what choices we make, according to this Augustinian approach, is that whatever we're choosing, we think we're choosing the good, because we cannot choose that which is bad for us. It would be counterintuitive to believe otherwise. And so even take, for example, a suicide, okay? Someone who chooses to take their own life can rationally only be doing so because they're in such a disturbed state of mind that their freedom has been limited, drastically limited, and that they are choosing something which they believe to be a good. All right, so being freed from whatever pain or suffering, or even as disordered as it would be, choosing non-being. Okay, so believing that to not exist would be better than to exist, right? So the debate that Hamlet is having in his famous soliloquy, for example. So with that understanding of our pursuit of goods in a limited way, Hart says that none of us, no finite being, is ever fully free to pursue the good. That all of us are conditioned by our inability to see the good clearly. So even the holiest person cannot possibly be seeking the good in an infinite way. And so, which is true. Everyone is limited in their pursuit of the good. And so what Hart is saying is that if nobody is fully free to pursue the good, then, and everyone has their freedoms limited to some degree, then how can even this free choice away from God, how can that free choice away from God really balance against the eternal reality of hell, right? And so I think that's a worthwhile discussion to enter into with Hart. Okay, and so then he takes that. So those two things is that if a finite life is lived apart from God, how does that merit an infinite, non-bound by time experience of pain and suffering? And then about the whole question of freedom, because one of the arguments that he's responding to is the argument that God creates us free, and he respects our freedom. And you've all heard this argument. This is like stock. This is what we teach, right? That we're free. God respects our freedom radically. And so if we choose away from them, he's not going to get in the way of that choice. He's going to let us choose away from him, even if it ends up in our eternal damnation, right? So Hart responds to that. We tend to believe that we're so free that we can choose, that God will respect our choice, even if it means in our eternal damnation. But Hart's point is that God, if he is truly good, which we believe he is, Hart believes that God could not allow that to happen. And so Hart uses the example of a father. And so we like to use family analogies because we believe that God's our father. And so he uses the example of a father who will allow his child to make choices and to fail to some degree in order to teach him or her, right? And so hopefully we do. Hopefully we've done this with our kids, is that we don't make every choice for them. We don't always go and catch them from stubbing their toe or stop them from making every mistake. Hopefully we allow them to make mistakes on their own, if they're not devastating mistakes, so that they can learn from them. But that's precisely the point that Hart makes, is he says, what father, if their child was about to make a mistake which was unreversible, which was totally detrimental to their good, who would just sit there and allow them to do that? Well, in an earthly sense, no father would do that. Every father would intervene and prevent the child from making that choice. And so Hart's point is that a totally good God could not allow a person to make that choice. And so again, that we talk about that God never will violate our free will. He always allows us to choose what we desire, even if that choice results in eternal damnation. Hart is saying that he can't tolerate that theologically. He says that if God is totally good, he's got to prevent that from happening. He's got to intervene, or he's got to, and so he talks about the idea of predestination, and so he says that if God knew that a creature was going to eternally suffer, that God would not create that creature, because that evil would so far outweigh the good that would come from their life. Okay, so again, I'm just recounting to you what Hart is saying for your consideration. He talks about so what Hart basically goes on to say is that in his studies, he says that he found that this, he calls them infernalists, which one thing about Hart is it seems pretty clear that he struggles with pride. That you read him and you're like, wow, he really comes across as being arrogant. But he's really smart, so it's probably hard for him not to come across that way. But he says that you don't see this belief in the infernalist belief, which he says those who believe in hell. He says you don't really see this in the first centuries of the church, and he says that you never see this widespread in the eastern part of the church. And he says that from the early church, both east and west, there's been this sense, and the word is the pneumatikoi. He says that this is a word that St. Paul uses, and he cites other theologians such as St. Gregory of Nazianzen of using this term, the pneumatikoi. Maybe Gregory doesn't use the term, but he uses the idea, according to Hart. But that basically, that there's what we teach the masses, there's what we teach the normal folks, and then there's the pneumatikoi, the spiritual persons. Okay? And so what Hart is saying is that from the early church, the pneumatikoi, those spiritual persons, the persons who are deep in theology and philosophy, did not hold a belief in eternal hell. He says that it was the teaching that we provide to the masses, which is the teaching about eternal hell. And he pulls out some interesting passages from Gregory of Nazianzen, for example, which seem to support his point, where there's talk about hell, and then there will be a line or two saying, now for those of you who have a deep understanding of the love of God, you might think about this differently, or something. I'm paraphrasing, but there's some interesting lines in there. This is something I brought up in class before. I think it was last month. I talked about the teaching of St. Paul about the way we teach about eating meat that's been sacrificed to idols, and that St. Paul essentially says that you can't scandalize others by eating meat that's been sacrificed to idols, but it's basically for those who don't know better. But for those who know that the meat sacrificed to idols isn't really tainted by anything real spiritually, because we know that those idols aren't real, it says for you, it's okay. Okay, so from the early church, and this is just kind of human nature too, there's this sense of that there's what those who know can do and believe, and then there's what those who don't know have to be taught. Okay, there's just always, I mean, and it sounds really condescending, it sounds kind of duplicitous, but there's kind of that sense, and we do it with other stuff. We do it with, going back to the family analogy, we do it that there's things that we teach our kids you have to do, but then we know that, well, once you grow up and you learn that, you know, you don't really have to do it that way. Okay, so it's interesting. It's an interesting point that Hart is making, I guess is what I'm saying. And so this came up in last month when we talked about some of the practices that we do regarding, you know, fasting and a lot of the different customs that we have, and this tension of getting to the heart of the matter of like, what are we really trying to create in the hearts of believers and the external practice. And so we talked about that tension of that, like some of those restraints, like as you grow in holiness, you can take away some of those restraints, but not necessarily, and not before the person is mature enough. And so this came up when we talked about St. John Henry Cardinal Newman, and he talks about the resilience of the church and being able to kind of negotiate its way through heresies and to negotiate its way through different customs of cultures throughout church history, because it's so strong that it's able to withstand the attack. And so, if you remember, it uses the example of like a construction example of a frame. So like a window frame, that a really strong frame is not the one that's the most rigid. It's the one that has a little bend to it, because it can withstand some shaking and some moving. And so those of you that were in the Dante class, we've used that analogy several times. Dante uses that for the souls in purgatory, is that they have to be able to kind of be responsive to the divine will, for example. And so, you know, an oak tree gets uprooted by the wind, or it breaks in half, whereas, you know, the wheat just kind of bends over with it. So all these analogies. So what the point that Hart is trying to make is that his belief is that throughout the history of the church, those who have really been deep in theology and philosophy don't hold that hell is really an eternal punishment for sinners. They hold possibly it's a temporary punishment. Okay, and so he posits that as one possibility, is that maybe hell is just how it's described in the New Testament. And so he talks about, you know, that we'll use images, but that are not that in the gospel, for example, you know, the images we get of Gehenna, that possibly they're not meant to be literal descriptions, that they are to prove a moral point. Okay, and so that's his contention, is that hell is either temporary, or there's some other dimension that isn't what has generally been taught. At the beginning of his book, he uses the example of, which I think probably a lot of us are familiar with, that basically hell would be, your experience of hell would, take out the word hell, that our experience of God's love differs based on our orientation towards it, right? And so in the book of the prophet Malachi, I think it's the last chapter of Malachi, chapter 3, uses this metaphor also, that this burning heat, which is like an oven, which can either consume or it can feel like healing rays. Okay, it's a beautiful analogy, and it's right before the beginning of the New Testament. But so that in that sense, that God's love, if we're oriented toward it, can be a beautiful experience of love and communion, but if we're turned away from it, would be an experience of exterior pain or even an assault against us. So other writers, C.S. Lewis has used the analogy of a party, where you know, hell is like everyone's having a party, and then you've willfully locked yourself, you know, away from it, whatever. And so it's the very joy of the party that you're furious about, and that which you take to be painful. Right? So imagine being stuck in a party and everyone else is having fun. It's the very joy that they're showing which adds to your pain. And so Lewis has used that example. St. Henry Cardinal Newman, in his Anglican days, so before he became a Roman Catholic, in his parochial and plain sermons, he uses the analogy of heaven being like a church, that you know, love being in the church. We experience joy there in the prayers and all the sacramentals and the whole experience. But if you stuck someone in there that didn't want to be there, they would find it to be painful and confusing and all of that. And so those are maybe some images that we're all familiar with. Hart takes it to another level. So he lays all out there, and he says for him, it can't even be that. He says for him, God's rescue mission is so final, so definitive, that he's going to rescue everyone, that he's not going to allow anyone to stay in that position, that if there's a party and there's somebody in the corner that's turned away from it and that is grumpy and experiencing pain and suffering, that he will rescue that person because he wants to bring them to his joy. So he says that God's grace is so unmerited. And he uses the example of our existence, for example. So he says our existence itself is totally unmerited. Nobody did anything to deserve existence in the world. And so for Hart, he says, if our existence is unmerited, why can't our salvation be totally unmerited? So I provided some notes for you, only about a page of excerpts. I broke it down into 4 main points that Hart is making, and I'm just offering this to you for your own reflection. Certainly not offering it to you to challenge, the doctrines that we believe in, but to allow you to just kind of engage with it and to consider it, and I'd love to hear any comments, questions, reflections on that idea. I know you haven't had much time to spend with it yet, but just as a way of challenge, for our Theology Institute, we don't have our guest speaker, but I thought this could be kind of like a guest speaker experience of that. David Bentley Hart's kind of like our guest speaker, although he can't speak for himself here. But questions or comments on Bentley's approach, or Hart's approach?
Does he offer any scriptural support for this position?
He talks about St. Paul, and I'd have to look up the citation, but so St. Paul talks about God's will that all be saved. That's one that he mentions, and so he basically says that if we really believe that God desires everyone to be saved, and then we also believe that not everyone is saved, how does that work? That's one that I know he mentions. I'm sure he's got others, but nothing comes to mind.
Yeah, Dusty, would that do away with the whole theory of purgatory then? Wouldn't hell be like purgatory if the punishment isn't eternal? How would that differ?
Right. That would seems like one possibility. If he sees it as being something bound by time, then yeah, I suppose it could be maybe analogous to what we think of as purgatory.
Dusty, many people who call themselves traditionalists have condemned Bishop Barron out of hand for one saying that there is no proof that anybody is in hell. Do you know if he has said any more about this?
No, but yes, I'm glad you brought that up. For those of you who don't know Bishop Barron, well, I guess all of you know him, at least through the textbook that you're reading right now. Bishop Barron has come under a lot of heat for his perspective on hell, which I haven't found anything doctrinally wrong with personally. Bishop Barron really likes Hans Urs von Balthasar, whom I mentioned. I really appreciate the work of Hans Urs von Balthasar. I said it, I know in certain groups of Catholics that would not be very popular. Hans Urs von Balthasar has a book written in the 70s called Dare We Hope That All Men Be Saved. In my reading of that book, he doesn't say anything that contradicts Catholic doctrine. He basically says what he says in the title is that can we hope that all men be saved? He doesn't say that all men are saved. But his point is that we have grounds to hope, and that in Father Balthasar's opinion, as Christians, we ought to hope that everyone be saved. I think the reading of the New Testament necessitates that we should hope for the salvation of all men. Paul tells us that that's the desire of God, that everyone be saved. But yes, Bishop Barron has voiced that the church does not teach that there is any soul in hell, and he's come under a lot of heat for that. And people will bring up things like, what about some of the visions that people have had of souls in hell? What about this? What about that? What about the teaching of the worm that burns in the fire that's unquenchable? All that stuff. But I appreciate Barron's perspective. But I don't know if he's responded. Not that I know of. I don't think he's responded to the criticisms.
Thank you.
Dusty, this is Stephanie. I was looking at the catechism as you were reading this, and of course the catechism is theology, but one thing I did notice is when the catechism talks about heaven and hell, and then it talks about a new heaven and a new earth when Christ returns, it mentions nothing about hell after Christ returns.
Mm-hmm.
So that is kind of, maybe there is something, I'm not saying that I agree with Hart or anything, but there is something that there's, like you say, there's parts of our theology where the Catholic Church, even though we have liked to define many things, we have not defined. Our church has not defined exactly what happens to hell after Christ returns. I mean, the section on hell says that those souls are there because if they have persisted in their mortal sin, and that is an if, then they are in hell for eternity. But it's interesting that it just says nothing about what happens to hell after Christ's return, and there is a new heaven and a new earth. It's all on the side of what happens to the souls who have been redeemed and are saved and are going to be with Jesus. So it's just an interesting point. It's something that is not spoken, like you say. I think Bishop Barron is right. Church has never condemned anyone to hell and claimed that someone is definitely in hell. And I think that's that is an interesting aspect of this discussion.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's very interesting.
Doesn't the whole question hinge on the word eternal? Like, basically, if there is such a thing as people in eternal hell, then that's the end of the discussion, right?
Yes.
Because there's several, I mean, I'm not a Greek scholar, but there's several verses that are translated eternal that discuss hell.
Right. So you're saying the question is on the, not on the existence of a place of torment, but on the eternity of it?
Right, because everyone agrees on that, at least in the Catholic realm, that, you know, whether it's purgatory or a non-eternal hell,
right.
There's some sort of suffering that you might go through on your process into heaven. But if there's an eternal hell, then the whole conversation that this guy is trying to put forward just doesn't. He's questioning it, but it seems like there's scripture that very clearly says eternal.
Yeah, that's
Matthew. Okay, so here's one. Matthew 18:8 talks about the better to be crippled, you know, than to be cast into the eternal fire.
right.
And Matthew 25, they will go into eternal punishment, and the righteous into eternal life.
Right.
Second Thessalonians has, they will pay the penalty of eternal destruction. It's not isolated. Revelation has several.
Right. Yeah. So what does that mean? I mean, I'm not asking you to answer that, but yeah. I mean, I think that's what the question hinges on.
Maybe a Greek word study on how they're translating eternal would be the only way to answer that for sure.
Right.
But at least in the English, it's pretty straightforward.
Right. Well, and then even then I think another level to that would be, again, even if we've established the language, what's the meaning, right? Because, you know, to use an example close to that, you know, about the plucking out of the eye, you know, using that same passage of, like, it doesn't really mean that you should pluck out your eye, right? I mean, I think that becomes part of the argument too, is that, so there's the words themselves, but then what's the intended meaning of like, what do the words signify? And do we separate doctrine from kind of hyperbolic encouragement, if you will, right? So, like, is language being used there to elicit a response, or is it there to be translated as doctrine? And I'm not trying to make a stance on either way, but I'm saying I think that's part of the debate.
Dusty?
Yes.
I think we'll go back even further before the thought. We can go back to Christ and his apostles, as if, because they would have been the chosen ones, they would have been the ones who would be considered the elite, if you want to use that term. And he washed their feet and said that they were to do the same. And I would say that if you refer to the people who aren't quite as knowledgeable as ones who have to be told about that there is a hell, but that we know, we're smarter, so we don't need to use that term for ourselves. We can know that it's not really real, hell isn't. And to think that the church would use that to control people, that they were responsible for teaching about Christ, to me is just flawed in the very beginning.
Sounds like Gnosticism, the secret
Yeah,
knowledge thing.
I think just the very foundation of his thinking is very flawed.
Yeah,
And
he
also,
does
I agree
mention-
with what he said about eternity. I think it's very clear that it's not just something that would disappear or be temporary punishment.
That's certainly one of the flaws of his book, in my opinion, is in his
Yeah.
conclusion. He does use the language of control. And so I feel like the way he lays out his argument, he could have done without that, because in the end, he uses that language of that, like, this is what the church has used to control. And I felt like that didn't add anything to his argument. That just made him sound like he was a conspiracy theorist or something. But yeah, people.
Dusty, I'm sorry. What did you say his religious background is?
I believe he's Eastern Orthodox.
Oh, that almost sounds Protestant, though. That almost sounds like the Protestant view of the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And that there's John Bossy was one of the theologian or one of the historians that looked at the Reformation. He says that's one of the things that came with the Reformation was this division into, instead of a community of love, it became a community of sin, life, or death, and made that division. And so it seems like that the heart's kind of using, like you said, both about the more Gnostic view and also a more divided view of the church that I don't know that we really believe existed before the 15th century, 14th, 16th century. So it's interesting.
That's a good point. And I don't, just from, I think, and he might have been brought up in a Protestant tradition. I kind of got the impression when he was talking about all of his different studies and all those different steps on his journey, kind of got the impression that he landed in Eastern Orthodoxy, but that might not have been where he started. So yeah, he might have some of that.
He was an Anglican and then he converted to Eastern Orthodox.
I can't hear.
Naomi, I can't quite hear you.
Bentley Hart was born an Anglican and converted to Eastern Orthodox.
Okay. Okay, an Anglican.
So here's a thought on the talking about you would stop your children from doing something that would have, severe eternal, permanent consequence. You wouldn't, let them teach themselves by, maiming themselves or whatever. Biblical language has the family, it refers to us as adopted. So would we even be considered in the family to be saved in that manner until we've been adopted through baptism?
Right. Yeah, I guess I don't
For
know.
that analogy to hold true.
Yeah, I don't. I know several times he uses the term the baptized. I don't know if he tries to press his argument to include non-believers. But that's an interesting question: is if he's presuming baptism. I know he does.
Well, if he's saying that if he's saying no one it spends eternity in hell, then he's saying that ultimately everyone is a son or a daughter and therefore will be saved because they're a son or a daughter. At least from the way you said it earlier.
Yeah. I don't know if I want to assign that to him or not, because he does talk. He talks about the relationship in sort of covenantal terms. So I don't know from his book, which I guess came from I guess he had a public lecture at Notre Dame in 2015 that he introduced this, and then people started attacking him on it, and I guess he wrote this book to try to clarify some of that. But offhand, I don't know what he would say to that. I don't know if he's saying that his argument is based on those that are in relationship, so like are in this family relationship, that now God will do this for them, or if he's talking about everyone. I don't know.
Well, you did say that he wouldn't even allow someone to be born if they were going to have that fate.
Right.
So that would include everyone who would be born.
Yeah. I think probably so. Since I guess so you would probably include this for everyone.
Of the two, I definitely appreciate Baron's take on it a little more. Just, I mean, yes, you can't condemn anyone for certain because nobody knows what happens in those seconds when someone's passing over.
Right.
But to kind of make the claim that no one will ever just seems really dangerous.
Yeah. Well, and he, and someone someone typed in the text comments, which I don't see all of these. I guess sometimes they pop up and sometimes they don't. But anyway, somebody typed that, yes, I hope for this too, but I'm not going to bank on it or something like that, which is, I think when I think about my own development and like when I first started asking myself serious questions about the faith and the afterlife, frankly, I think that's where I kind of landed probably like 20 years ago. I kind of landed on this perspective that, hey, this is what's been taught. This is how I'm going to base my life. I'm certainly going to shoot for the straight and narrow, the highway. But am I really going to say that I truly believe that all these people that are missing the boat, that they're going to be suffering eternal consequences because they're distracted or confused or because they were raised in the wrong faith tradition, or they, do I really believe that? I don't know. I hope not, I guess. And I think saying that I hope not is, I think, pretty good grounds to stand on. But so yeah, so I appreciated that comment. Is kind of like, this is good for our reflection. Should it, and I think maybe where the rubber hits the road is, should this reflection, and so for somebody like Hart, is that going to make him say, well, I'm not going to worry about the morality of the church, or I'm not going to worry about, I hope not. And I think that's kind of the whole tension in this debate is like, how is it going to affect how people live? And so his point is that maybe we talk a lot about hell because we're trying to scare people into the right behavior, but ultimately we desire them to choose the right behavior, not because of fear of hell. I mean, we even say this, the version of the Act of Contrition that I memorized, the older one, even uses that language, is that we're admitting our fear of the loss of heaven and the pains of hell, but we're saying that ultimately the reason that I don't want to sin is because it offends God and because I desire that loving relationship with him. So even in like the structure of that prayer, it's kind of like scaffolding of like we start with the fear of hell, but that's not where it ends. And so if the only reason that we're doing the things that the church tells us to do is because we fear punishment, is that really the highest expression of love? I think that's fodder for fruitful reflection, I think. So,
Dusty,
like I said, I'm not going to defend Hart's position, but I'm glad I read the book, and I think it's
Dusty,
good discussion.
Dusty,
Yes.
Dusty.
Naomi?
I want to say something that Wikipedia say that Hart convert from High Church Anglicanism to Eastern Orthodoxy. Politically, he identifies as a Christian socialist as well as a Democrat socialist, and is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, so we need to consider the source.
Well, yeah, I don't want to get into all of that.
Yeah, it's not good to get it, kind of hard to get into ad hominem, because then you're judging his intentions and not his works.
Yeah.
So I kind of.
No, I'm not disagreeing with the fact that it's good to know the source, but
Background, yeah.
I want to try to focus on his argument and consider that on its merits.
Yeah. Well, Jerry just posted she got caught by her husband having admitted to buying a book. She's just ordered it for May's Day. So she's going to be reading. So maybe we can have another discussion. It would be interesting to know how he contends, though, with words of Jesus when he says it will be eternal punishment.
Mm-hmm.
Because Jesus says eternal, he means eternally. I think that would be the interesting aspect.
Yeah, he's got some explaining to do. It's an interesting premise, but yeah, there's some things that are not that easy to explain away.
Dusty,
Yeah,
can
George.
you think of eternally to the end of time?
Long.
But after, when Christ comes again, time is over.
Mm.
So you got to go into what exactly do we mean by time?
Right.
I'd like to expound on that a little bit more, if I may, Dusty. Yeah, of course, Jesus said, before Abraham, I am. So this indicates that God exists throughout time. It's not limited by time like we are. And it's also my understanding. By the way, this is just a theoretical discussion, just a thought I'm throwing out here for discussion in the spirit of theology, not doctrine. But if we consider that if we become like God in the afterlife, there is a possibility, I am thinking, that we too would exist throughout time and not be limited by time. If that is the case, the idea of an eternal hell seems to make a little more sense. That is, time will not pass. There is a possibility, I don't know, this is just an idea, that in the afterlife, time will not pass like it does for us now. That if that is the case, then that puts this idea of an eternal hell in a different light. That's all I have to say.
It does. Yeah. No. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That's something to consider for sure. There's a bear coming up behind you, Rick. I like your background. Other thoughts or? Okay, well, do we still have sound again? Yeah, okay, I thought I muted everyone for a second. So I'm just reading the comments and things too, so good. Well, this is stimulated some good reflection and conversation. Again, I'm not intending to scandalize anyone, but just to stimulate your thinking and your reflection, I think is helpful. At least it is for me. So if there's no other comments or questions, that's all I had for today. Just looking forward, Holy Week next week. So I want to wish everyone a great Holy Week. I don't want, and as far as like the future of the class and things, I don't want to say too much, but things are kind of up in the air right now, to be honest, with the Spiritual Life Center. yeah, I don't want to say too much, but we'll keep the Spiritual Life Center in your prayers. We'll keep you in our prayers, and hopefully we'll be proceeding with some more classes in the near future. So again, thanks for coming, for tuning in online, and hopefully we'll meet again in May for our final session. All right.